Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. Not wanting to face the violence of World War II, Yossarian, an American soldier, has gone to an Italian military hospital claiming to have a pain in his liver. The doctors seem unable to prove that he is well, so they let him stay, though they are perplexed that his condition is neither improving nor worsening. The hospital patients are required to censor letters traveling between the soldiers and their loved ones at home. Yossarian plays games with the letters, deleting words according to his own arbitrary rules and affixing his signature as Washington Irving. He shares the hospital ward with his friend Dunbar, a bandaged, immobile man called the Soldier in White, and a pair of nurses who appear to hate Yossarian. An affable Texan is admitted to the ward one day, and the Texan tries to convince the patients that decent folk deserve extra votes. The Texan's patriotism deeply annoys the other patients. Meanwhile, a chaplain comes to see Yossarian, who enjoys the chaplain's company. But within 10 days of the Texan's arrival at the hospital, almost everyone, including Yossarian, flees the ward out of annoyance with the Texan, recovering from his or her ailments and returning to active duty. When he leaves the hospital, Yossarian feels that he is the only one concerned about the senseless war in which millions of young men are bombing each other. He remembers arguing about the nature of the war with an officer in his group named Clevenger. Yossarian had claimed that everyone was trying to kill him, while Clevenger argued that no one was trying to kill Yossarian personally. Yossarian had rejected Clevenger's arguments about countries and honor. For Yossarian, the salient fact was that people kept shooting at him. Yossarian sees his roommate, and finds out that Clevenger is still missing. He remembers the last time he and Clevenger called each other crazy, during a night at the officers' club when Yossarian announced to everyone present that he was superhuman because no one had managed to kill him yet. Yossarian is suspicious of everyone when he gets out of the hospital. He has a delicious meal in Milo's gourmet mess hall, then talks to Dr. Nika, who enrages Yossarian by telling him that Colonel Cathcart has raised the number of missions required before a soldier can be discharged from 45 to 50. At the time of this change, Yossarian had flown 44 missions. Or tells Yossarian a nonsensical story about how he liked to stuff crab apples in his cheeks when he was younger. Yossarian briefly remembers an episode in Rome during which a whore beat or over the head with her shoe. Yossarian reflects on Orr's size. He is even smaller than Hupple, a young boy who lives near Hungry Joe's tent. Hungry Joe has nightmares whenever he is not scheduled to fly a mission the next day, and his screaming keeps the whole camp awake. Hungry Joe's tent is near a road where the men sometimes pick up girls and take them out to the tall grass across the road from an open-air movie theater. A USO, United Service Organizations, troop that visited the theater that afternoon has been sent by an ambitious general named P. Peckham, who hopes to take over the command of Yossarian's unit from General Dreedel. General Peckham's troubleshooter, Colonel Cargill, used to be a marketing executive paid by Wall Street firms to fail at marketing so that they could establish tax losses. Cargill does much the same thing now as a colonel. He fails most notably at bringing enthusiasm to the men, some of whom have finished their 50 missions and anxiously hope their orders to return home arrive before Colonel Cathcart raises the number of missions again. Yossarian feels sick, but Dr. Nika refuses to ground him. Dr. Nika advises Yossarian to emulate Havermeyer, a fearless bombardier, and make the best of his situation. But Yossarian thinks that his fear is healthy. The narrator notes that Havermeyer likes to shoot mice in the middle of the night, and that he once woke Hungry Joe with a shot that compelled him to dive into a slit trench. These slit trenches had mysteriously appeared beside every tent the morning following the mess officer Milo Minderbinder's bombing of the squadron. The narrator explains that Hungry Joe is crazy and thus Yossarian is trying to give him advice. Hungry Joe won't listen, however, because he thinks Yossarian is crazy. Dr. Nika, in turn, tells Yossarian that his own problems are worse than Hungry Joe's because the war has interrupted his lucrative medical practice. Yossarian remembers trying to disrupt the educational meeting in Captain Black's intelligence tent by asking unanswerable questions, which caused group headquarters to make a rule that the only people who could ask questions were the ones who never did. This rule comes from Colonel Cathcart and Lieutenant Colonel Corn. These two colonels also approved the construction of a skeet shooting range at which Yossarian never hits anything. Dunbar, though, shoots skeet frequently because he hates it. Dunbar believes that when he engages in activities that are boring or uncomfortable, time passes more slowly, and he thereby lengthens his life. He argues with Clevenger about this theory. Meanwhile, XPFC Wintergreen has started a panic among the officers in Rome by telephoning them and saying only, T.S. Eliot. Although he intends these words as a response to a general memo from a colonel saying that it would be hard to name a poet who makes any money, General Peckham assumes that the words constitute a coded message and suffers great anxiety as a result. In the tent at Doc Danica and an alcoholic Native American named Chief White Half-Oat share, Doc Danica describes his corrupt Staten Island medical practice to Yossarian. He tells him about some sexually inept newlyweds who once visited his office. Chief White Half-Oat enters, telling Yossarian that Doc Danica is crazy. Half-Oat then relates the story of his own family. Because every place that he and his family settled turned out to be on top of a significant oil supply, major oil companies began following them, using them as human divining rods. The oil companies then kicked them off the land, forcing the family to live a nomadic life. Yossarian again pleads with Doc Danica to be grounded, asking if he would be grounded if he were crazy. Doc Danica replies that he would, and Yossarian argues that he is indeed crazy. Doc Danica then describes Catch-22, a regulation holding that, in order to be grounded for insanity, a pilot must ask to be grounded. But any pilot who asks to be grounded must be sane, since sane people would never want to fly bombing missions. Impressed, Yossarian takes Doc Danica's word for it, just as he had taken Orr's word about the flies in Appleby's eyes. Orr had insisted that there are flies in Appleby's eyes, and though Yossarian had no idea what Orr meant, he believed him because Orr had never lied to him before. Yossarian begins thinking about bombing missions and how much he hates his position in the nose of the plane, where he is separated from the escape hatch by a passage just wide enough to fit through. On these bombing missions, Yossarian is always terrified for his life, and he pleads with the pilot, McWhat, to avoid anti-aircraft fire. He remembers one mission when, while the squadron was taking evasive action, Dobbs, the co-pilot, went crazy and started screaming, "Help him!" The plane spun out of control and Yossarian believed he was going to die. Enigmatically, the narrator states that someone named Snowden lay dying in the back of the plane. Although Hungry Joe has already flown his 50 missions, the orders to send him home never come, and he continues to scream at night. Doc Danica ignores Hungry Joe's problems and instead complains about having been forced to leave his clinic. Hungry Joe is mad with lust. His desperate attempts to take pictures of naked women always end in failure, as the pictures do not come out. In order to get women to pose for him, Hungry Joe pretends to be an important Life magazine photographer. Ironically, he really was a photographer for Life before the war. Hungry Joe has flown 6 tours of duty, but every time he finishes one, Colonel Cathcart raises the number of missions required before Hungry Joe can be sent home. With each increase in the minimum number of missions, Hungry Joe's nightmares stop until he finishes another tour. The narrator tells us that Colonel Cathcart is very brave about volunteering his men for the most dangerous missions. Appleby, another member of the squadron, is equally brave in his ping-pong games. One night, Orr, Yossarian's roommate, attacks Appleby in the middle of a game. A fight breaks out, and Chief White Half-Oat breaks the nose of Colonel Moodis, General Dreedle's son-in-law. General Dreedle so enjoys witnessing this abuse of his son-in-law that he keeps calling Chief White Half-Oat in to repeat the performance, and moves him into Doc Danica's tent to make sure that Half-Oat remains in top physical condition. XPFC Wintergreen gives Yossarian another definition of Catch-22, one that requires him to fly the extra missions that Colonel Cathcart orders, even though 27th Air Force regulations demand only 40 missions. The reasoning is that the regulations state also that Yossarian must obey all of Cathcart's orders, and Cathcart has raised the number of missions again, this time to 55. McWhat, Yossarian's pilot, manages to display a cheeriness in the face of war, even though he is perfectly sane. This contradiction leads Yossarian to believe that McWhat, who is smiling and polite and who loves to whistle show tunes, is the craziest combat man in the unit. Yossarian gets a letter from Dr. Nika about his liver that orders the mess hall to give Yossarian all the fresh fruit he wants. Nervous that his liver will improve, which would mean having to leave the hospital, Yossarian refuses to eat the fruit. Milo, however, tries to persuade Yossarian to sell the fruit on the black market, but Yossarian refuses. Milo explains to Yossarian his desire to serve the best meals in the entire world in his mess hall and his nervousness about his chef, Corporal Snark, who poisoned his entire previous squadron by putting GI soap in the sweet potatoes. Milo becomes indignant when he learns that a CID, Criminal Investigation Division, man is searching for a criminal who has been forging Washington Irving's name in censored letters. He thinks the investigation is a ploy to expose him for selling items on the black market. Milo wants to organize the men into a syndicate, a concept that he tries to explain to Yossarian by stealing McWhat's bedsheet, ripping it into pieces, and redistributing it. Yossarian does not understand Milo's version of economics, which largely involves cheating whomever he is trading with and then claiming moral superiority. Clevenger does not understand Milo's plan either, even though he usually understands everything about the war except for the arbitrary way in which things happen. Yossarian remembers training in America with Clevenger under Lieutenant Skyskoff, who had been obsessed with parades, and whose wife, along with her friend Dory Does, had slept with all the men under her husband's command. Lieutenant Skyskoff hates Clevenger and finally gets him sent to trial under a belligerent colonel. At the trial, Clevenger is unable to communicate his innocence because he is harangued about using improper modes of address. Clevenger is extremely confused by his superior's hatred of him. He realizes that Lieutenant Skyskoff and the colonel harbor an animosity toward him that no enemy soldier ever could. The narrator explains the details of Major's troubled childhood. His unfortunate name is a result of his father's twisted sense of humor, and causes Major much distress throughout his youth. Major also bears a strong resemblance to Henry Fonda, upon which people constantly comment, and he does so well in school as a child that the FBI monitors him on suspicion that he is a communist. His troubles continue when an IBM computer error makes him a major the day he joins the army, resulting in his new name, Major. His sudden promotion stuns his drill sergeant, who then has to train a man who is suddenly his superior officer. Luckily, Major applies for aviation cadet training and is sent away to Lieutenant Skyskoff, who is himself confused about how to interact with an officer who outranks him but to whom he is a commanding officer. Skyskoff trains Major quickly in order to get rid of him, and sends him to Pianosa, where Yossarian's squadron is stationed. Not long after arriving in Pianosa, where Major is happy for the first time in his life, he is made squadron commander by a vengeful Colonel Cathcart. As a result, Major loses all his friends, who become servile in his presence. Major has always been a drab, mediocre sort of person and has never had friends before. He lapses into an awkward depression and refuses to be seen in his office. To make himself feel better, Major forges Washington Irving's name on official documents. He is confused about everything, including his official relationship to Major de Coverley, his executive officer. He does not know whether he is Major de Coverley's subordinate or vice versa. A CID man comes to investigate the Washington Irving scandal, but Major denies knowledge of it. The incompetent CID man believes him, as does another CID man who arrives shortly thereafter, then leaves to investigate the first CID man. Major starts wearing dark glasses and a false mustache when forging Washington Irving's name. He even forges a few John Milton signatures, just for variety. One day, Yossarian tackles Major and demands to be grounded. Major sadly tells Yossarian that there is nothing he can do. Clevenger's plane disappears in a cloud off the coast of Elba, and he is presumed dead. Yossarian, however, is unable to conceive of Clevenger's death, and instead assumes that he is simply, and inexplicably, missing. The narrator then describes XPFC Wintergreen's past. Back in the US, XPFC Wintergreen continually goes AWOL. He is required to dig holes and fill them up again as punishment, work he approaches as a duty to his country. One day, XPFC Wintergreen nicks a water pipe, and water sprays everywhere. Since Chief White Half-Oat is with Wintergreen, everyone assumes that it is oil, and Half-Oat and Wintergreen are both sent away to Pianosa. Yossarian recalls Mudd, a soldier who had arrived at the camp and died in combat before even reporting for duty. Nobody can actually remember Mudd, but his belongings remain in Yossarian's tent and seem to be contaminated with death. This reminder of death causes Yossarian to think about the deadly mission of the Great Big Siege of Bologna, for which Colonel Cathcart had bravely volunteered his men. At the time, not even sick men could be grounded by doctors. What of the doctors? Dr. Stubbs asked cynically what point there was to saving lives when everyone was going to die anyway. Dunbar replied that the point was to live as long as possible and forget about the fact that death was inevitable. Captain Black is pleased to hear that Colonel Cathcart has volunteered the men for the lethal mission of bombing Bologna. Captain Black hates the men and gloats about their terrifying, violent task. He is extremely ambitious and had hoped to be promoted to squadron commander, but when Major is picked over him, he lapses into a deep depression, out of which the Bologna mission lifts him. Captain Black tries to get revenge on Major by initiating the glorious Loyalty Oath Crusade, during which he forces all the men to swear elaborate oaths of loyalty before doing basic things like eating meals. He then refuses to let Major sign a loyalty oath and hopes, thereby, to make him appear disloyal. The glorious Loyalty Oath Crusade is a major event in the camp until the fearsome Major de Coverley puts an end to it by hollering, "Gimme eat!" in the mess hall without signing an oath. It rains interminably before the Bologna mission, and the bombing run is delayed. The men all hope it will never stop raining. When it does, Yossarian moves the bomb line on the map so that the commanding officers will think that Bologna has already been captured. Yossarian also gives the entire squadron diarrhea by poisoning the food so that they won't have to fly. The rain then starts again. In the meantime, XPFC Wintergreen tries to sell Yossarian a cigarette lighter, going into competition with Milo as a black market trader. He is aghast that Milo has cornered the entire world market for Egyptian cotton but is unable to sell any of it. The men are terrified and miserable about having to bomb Bologna. Clevenger and Yossarian argue about whether it is Yossarian's duty to bomb Bologna, and by the middle of the second week of waiting, everyone in the squadron is as emaciated as Hungry Joe. One night, Yossarian, Nately, and Dunbar go for a drunken drive with Chief White Half-Oat. They crash a jeep and realize that it has stopped raining. Back in the tents, Hungry Joe is trying to shoot Hupple's cat, which has been giving him nightmares, and the men force Hungry Joe to fight the cat fairly. The cat runs away, and Hungry Joe is satisfied. When he goes back to sleep, however, he has another nightmare about the cat. Major de Coverley is a daunting, majestic man with a lion's mane of white hair, an eagle's gaze, and a transparent eye patch. Everyone is afraid of him, and no one will talk to him. His sole duty is traveling to major cities captured by the Americans to rent rooms in which his men can take leave. He spends the rest of his time playing horseshoes. Major de Coverley always manages to be photographed with the first wave of American troops moving into a city, a fact that perplexes both the enemy and the American commanders. He seems to be a force of nature, and yet Yossarian is able to fool him by moving the bomb line. Major de Coverley has traveled to enemy-controlled Florence, and has not yet returned. The narrator relates that Milo once approached de Coverley on the Horseshoe Range, successfully requesting authorization to import eggs on Air Force planes. We also learn that Colonel Cathcart had attempted to give Yossarian a medal some time earlier. When Yossarian was brave, he had circled over a target twice in order to hit it, and on the second pass, Kraft, a younger pilot from the division, had been killed by shrapnel. Not knowing how to rebuke Yossarian for his foolhardiness, the authorities decided to stave off criticism by giving him a medal. The squadron finally receives the go-ahead to bomb Bologna, but by this time Yossarian does not feel like going over the target even once. He pretends that his plane's intercom system is broken and orders his pilot, Kid Sampson, to turn back. They land at the deserted airfield just before dawn, feeling strangely morose. Yossarian takes a nap on the beach and wakes up when the planes fly back. Not a single plane has been hit. Yossarian thinks that cloud cover must have prevented them from bombing the city and that they will have to make another attempt. But he is wrong. Facing no anti-aircraft fire, the Americans bombed the city without incurring any losses. Captain Pilchard and Captain Wren ineffectually reprimand Yossarian and his crew for turning back and inform the men that since they missed the ammunition dumps the first time, they will have to bomb Bologna again. Yossarian confidently flies in, assuming there will be no anti-aircraft fire, and he is stunned when shrapnel begins firing up toward him through the skies. He furiously directs McWhut into evasive maneuvers and fights with the strangely cheerful Arfi until the bombs are dropped. Yossarian does not die, though many other men in the squadron do, and the plane lands safely. Yossarian heads immediately for emergency rest leave in Rome. Luciana is a beautiful Italian woman whom Yossarian meets at a bar in Rome. After he buys her dinner and dances with her, she agrees to sleep with him, but not right then. She will come to his room the next morning. She does, but then angrily refuses to sleep with Yossarian until she cleans his room, disgustedly calling him a pig. Finally, she lets him sleep with her. Afterward, Yossarian falls in love with her and asks her to marry him. She says she won't marry him because he is crazy. She knows he is crazy because no one in his right mind would marry a girl who was not a virgin. She tells him about a scar she got when the Americans bombed her town. Suddenly, Hungry Joe rushes in with his camera, and Yossarian and Luciana have to get dressed. Laughing, they go outside, where they part ways. Luciana gives Yossarian her number, telling him that she expects him to tear it up as soon as she leaves because she thinks that he is impressed with himself that such a pretty girl would sleep with him for free. He asks her why on earth he would do such a thing. As soon as she leaves, though, Yossarian, impressed with himself that such a pretty girl would sleep with him for free, tears up her number. Almost immediately he regrets doing so, and, after learning that Colonel Cathcart has raised the number of missions to 40, he makes the anguished decision to go straight to the hospital. Yossarian has returned to the hospital, where he finds life and death more palatable than in his recurring memories of being on a bomb run with Snowden dying in the back, whispering, "I'm cold." At the hospital, death is orderly and polite, and there is no inexplicable violence. Dunbar is in the hospital with Yossarian, and they are both perplexed by the soldier in white, a man completely covered in plaster bandages. The men in the hospital discuss the injustice of mortality. Some men are killed and some are not, and some men get sick and some do not, without any pattern or logic. Some time earlier, Clevenger had tried to explain why there might be some justice in such illogical deaths, but Yossarian was too busy keeping track of all the forces trying to kill him to listen. Later, Yossarian and Hungry Joe collect lists of fatal diseases that they can claim to have. Doc Danica, however, frequently refuses to ground them even when they claim to have these diseases. The doctor tells Yossarian that after Yossarian flies his 55 missions he will think about helping Yossarian. The first time Yossarian ever goes to the hospital, he is still a private. He feigns an abdominal pain, but when the doctors decide he has been cured, he pretends to have the mysterious ailment of another soldier in the ward who says he sees everything twice. He spends Thanksgiving in the hospital and vows to spend all future Thanksgivings there. But he breaks that oath when he spends the next Thanksgiving in bed with Lieutenant Skyskoff's wife. arguing about God. After Yossarian claims he is cured of seeing everything twice, he is asked to pretend to be a dying soldier whose mother, father, and brother have come to visit him. The family, which has traveled to visit their family member, does not know that he died that morning. The doctors bandage Yossarian, who pretends to be the dying soldier. The soldier's father asks Yossarian to tell God that it is not right for men to die so young. The ambitious Colonel Cathcart browbeats the chaplain, demanding a prayer before each bombing run, an idea he takes from the Saturday Evening Post. He then abandons the idea after the chaplain suggests that God might punish them for not including the enlisted men. The chaplain timidly mentions that some of the men have complained about Colonel Cathcart's habit of raising the number of missions required every few weeks, but Colonel Cathcart ignores him. On his way home, the chaplain meets Colonel Corn, Colonel Cathcart's wily, cynical sidekick. Colonel Corn mocks Colonel Cathcart in front of the chaplain and is highly suspicious of a plum tomato that Colonel Cathcart offered the chaplain. At his tent in the woods, the chaplain encounters the hostile Corporal Wickham, his atheistic assistant, who resents him deeply for holding back his career. Corporal Wickham tells the chaplain that a CID man suspects the chaplain of signing Washington Irving's name to official papers and of stealing plum tomatoes. The poor chaplain is very unhappy, because he feels helpless to improve anyone's life. Colonel Cathcart has become preoccupied with Yossarian's behavior, particularly his complaints about the number of required missions and the fact that he appeared naked at his medal ceremony shortly after Snowden's death. Yossarian had refused to wear clothes to the ceremony because Snowden, dying in the back of the plane, had bled all over him, and Yossarian never wanted to wear a uniform again. Yossarian is also responsible for a moaning epidemic at the briefing before the Avignon mission during which Snowden was killed. He started moaning because the mission's dangers meant that he might never again sleep with a beautiful woman. Colonel Cathcart wishes he knew how to solve the problem posed by Yossarian's mischief, for this would impress General Dreedel, Cathcart's commanding officer. General Dreedel, however, does not care what his men do, as long as they remain alive in reliable military quantities. He travels everywhere with a buxom nurse and worries mostly about Colonel Moodis, his son-in-law, whom he despises and thus occasionally asks Chief White Halffoot to punch in the nose. The narrator relates that Colonel Corn once tried to undercut Colonel Cathcart by giving a flamboyant briefing to impress General Dreedel. General Dreedel, unimpressed, told Colonel Cathcart that Colonel Corn made him sick. The enigmatic references to Snowden's death are finally cleared up. Snowden's death is the moment at which Yossarian loses his nerve. Flying a mission after Colonel Corn's extravagant briefing, Snowden is killed when Dobbs goes crazy and seizes the plane's controls from Hubble. As he dies, Snowden pleads for Yossarian's help, saying he is cold. Dobbs is a terrible pilot and a wreck of a man. He later tells Yossarian that he plans to kill Colonel Cathcart before he raises the required number of missions again. Dobbs sees this action as the only way to respond to Cathcart's foolhardiness. When he asks for Yossarian's approval, Yossarian is unable to give it, and Dobbs abandons his plan. The narrator then describes an episode in which Yossarian and Milo take a trip to stock up on supplies. As they travel, and Yossarian gradually realize the extent of Milo's control over the black market and his vast international influence. He is the mayor of Palermo, the assistant governor-general of Malta, the vice-shah of Oran, the caliph of Baghdad, the imam of Damascus, the sheikh of Araby, and is worshipped as a god in parts of Africa. Every region has embraced him because he has revitalized their economies with his syndicate, in which everybody has a share. Nevertheless, throughout their trip, and Yossarian are forced to sleep in the plane while Milo enjoys lavish palaces, and they are finally awakened in the middle of the night so that Milo can rush his shipment of red bananas to their next stop. One evening, Nately finds his whore in Rome again after a long search. He tries to convince Yossarian and Arfai to take two of her friends for $30 each. Arfai objects, stating that he has never had to pay for sex. Nately's whore is sick of Nately and begins to swear at him. Hungry Joe arrives, and the group abandons Arfai and goes to the apartment building where the girls live. Here the men find a seemingly endless flow of naked young women, and hungry Joe is torn between taking in the scene and rushing back for his camera. Nately argues about nationalism and moral duty with an old man who lives in the building. The old man claims Italy is doing better than America in the war because, as Italy has already been occupied, Italians are no longer being killed. He then points out that even America probably won't last as long as frogs, which have been around for 500 million years. The patriotic, idealistic Nately argues somewhat haltingly for America's international supremacy and the values it represents. But he is troubled by the fact that the old man reminds him of his father. Nately's whore tortures Nately with her indifference, eventually abandoning him and going to bed while he argues with the old man. When Nately finally does get to sleep with his whore the next morning, her little sister almost immediately interrupts them. By April, Milo's influence is massive. He controls the international black market, plays a major role in the world economy, and uses Air Force planes from countries all over the world to carry his supply shipments. The planes are repainted with an M&M Enterprises logo, but Milo continues to insist that everybody has a share in his syndicate. Milo contracts with the Americans to bomb the Germans and with the Germans to shoot down American planes. German anti-aircraft guns contracted by Milo even shot down Mud, the dead man in Yossarian's tent, for which Yossarian holds a grudge against Milo. Milo wants Yossarian's help to concoct a solution for unloading his massive holdings of Egyptian cotton, which he cannot sell and which threaten to ruin his entire operation. One evening after dinner, Milo's planes begin to bomb Milo's own camp. He has landed another contract with the Germans, and dozens of men are wounded and killed during the attack. Almost everyone wants to end M&M Enterprises right then, but Milo shows them how much money they have all made, and almost all of the survivors forgive him. While Yossarian sits naked in a tree watching Snowden's funeral, Milo seeks him out to talk to him about the cotton. He gives Yossarian some chocolate-covered cotton and tries to convince him it is really candy. Yossarian tells Milo to ask the government to buy his cotton, and Milo is struck by the intelligence of the idea. The chaplain is troubled that no one seems to treat him as a regular human being and everyone is uncomfortable in his presence. Furthermore, he is intimidated by the soldiers and generally ineffectual as a religious leader. He grows increasingly miserable and is sustained solely by the religious visions he has seen since his arrival, including the vision of the naked man in the tree at Snowden's funeral. The naked man was, of course, Yossarian. He dreams of his wife and children dying horribly in his absence. He tries to see Major about the number of missions the men are asked to fly, but, like everyone else, finds that Major will not allow him into his office except when he is out. On the way to see Major a second time, the chaplain encounters Flume, Chief White Halfoot's old roommate, who is so afraid of having his throat slit while he sleeps that he has begun living in the forest. The chaplain then learns that Colonel Cathcart has promoted Corporal Whitcomb to sergeant for an idea that the colonel believes will land him in the Saturday Evening Post. The chaplain tries to mingle with the men at the officers' club, but Colonel Cathcart periodically throws him out. The chaplain begins doubting everything, even God. The night Nately falls in love with his whore, she sits naked from the waist down in a room full of enlisted men playing blackjack. None of the enlisted men is interested except Nately, but she eventually gets sick of him and refuses to accept the money he offers her to stay. Arfi calls her a slut, and Nately is deeply offended. Arfi is the navigator of the flight on which Yossarian is finally hit by flak. Yossarian is wounded in the leg and taken to the hospital, where he and Dunbar change identities by ordering lower-ranking men to trade beds with them. Dunbar pretends to be a fortiori. Finally, they are caught by Nurse Kramer and Nurse Duckett, who takes Yossarian by the ear and puts him back to bed. The next morning, while Nurse Duckett is smoothing the sheets at the foot of his bed, Yossarian thrusts his hand up her skirt. She shrieks and rushes away, and Dunbar grabs her bosom from behind. When a furious doctor finally rescues her, Yossarian tries to plead insanity. He says that he has a recurring dream about a fish. He is assigned an appointment with Major Sanderson, the hospital's psychiatrist. Sanderson, however, is more interested in discussing his own problems than Yossarian's. Yossarian's friends visit him in the hospital. Dobbs again offers to kill Colonel Cathcart, and finally, after Yossarian admits that he thinks that people are trying to kill him and that he has not adjusted to the war, Major Sanderson decides that Yossarian really is crazy and should be sent home. But because of the identity mix-up perpetrated by Yossarian and Dunbar earlier in their hospital stay, there is a mistake, and a fortiori is sent home instead. Furious, Yossarian goes to see Doc Danica, but Doc Danica will not ground Yossarian for his insanity, rhetorically asking who would fight if all the crazy men got sent home. Yossarian goes to see Dobbs and tells him to go ahead and kill Colonel Cathcart. But Dobbs has finished his 60 missions and is waiting to be sent home. He no longer has a reason to kill Colonel Cathcart. When Yossarian says that Colonel Cathcart will simply raise the number of missions again, Dobbs says that he will wait and see, but that perhaps or would help Yossarian kill the colonel. Or crashed his plane again while Yossarian was in the hospital and was fished out of the ocean. None of the life jackets in his plane worked because Milo took out the carbon dioxide tanks to use for making ice cream sodas. Now, Or is tinkering with the stove that he is trying to build in his and Yossarian's tent, and he suggests that Yossarian try flying a mission with him for practice in case he ever has to make a crash landing. Yossarian broods about the rumored second mission to Bologna. Or is making noise and irritating him, and Yossarian imagines killing him, which Yossarian finds a relaxing thought. They talk about women, or says they do not like Yossarian, and Yossarian replies that they are crazy. Or tells Yossarian that he knows Yossarian has asked not to fly with him, and he offers to tell Yossarian why a naked girl was hitting him with her shoe outside Nately's whore's little sister's room in Rome. Yossarian laughingly declines. The next time Or flies a mission, he again crashes his plane into the ocean. This time, his survival raft drifts away from the others and he disappears. The men are dismayed when they learn that General Peckham has transferred Skyskoff, now a colonel, to his staff. Peckham is pleased because he thinks the move will increase his strength compared to that of his rival, General Dreidel. Colonel Skyskoff is dismayed by the news that he cannot bring his wife along, and that he will no longer be able to conduct parades every afternoon. Skyskoff immediately irritates his colleagues in group headquarters, and Peckham takes him along for an inspection of Colonel Cathcart's squadron briefing. At the preliminary briefing, the men are displeased to learn that they will be bombing an undefended village into rubble. They don't know that the only purpose of the missions is to impress General Peckham with the clean aerial photography enabled by their bomb patterns. When Peckham and Skyskoff arrive, Cathcart becomes angry that another colonel has appeared to rival him. He gives the briefing himself, and though he feels shaky and lacks confidence, he makes it through and congratulates himself on a job well done under pressure. On the bombing run, Yossarian has a flashback to the mission during which Snowden died, and he panics. When McWood starts pulling daredevil stunts, he threatens to kill McWood if he does not follow orders. He is worried that McWood will hold a grudge, but after the mission, McWood seems concerned only about Yossarian's health. Yossarian has begun seeing Nurse Duckett, and he enjoys making love to her on the beach. Sometimes, while they sit looking at the ocean, Yossarian thinks about all the people who have died underwater, including Orr and Clevenger. One day, McWood is buzzing the beach in his plane as a joke, when he accidentally flies too low and the propeller slices Kid Sampson in half. Kid Sampson's body splatters all over the beach. Back at the base, everyone is occupied with the disaster. McWood, meanwhile, does not land his plane but keeps flying higher and higher. Yossarian runs down the runway yelling at McWood to come down, but he knows what McWood is going to do. McWood crashes his plane into the side of a mountain, killing himself. Colonel Cathcart is so upset that he raises the number of missions to 65. When Colonel Cathcart learns that Doc Danica was also killed in the crash, he raises the number of missions to 70. Actually, Doc Danica was not killed in the crash, but the records, which Doc Danica, hating to fly, bribed Yossarian to alter, maintain that the doctor was in the plane with McWhat, collecting some flight time. Doc Danica is surprised to hear that he is dead, and his wife in America, who receives a letter to that effect from the military, is shattered. Heroically, she is cheered to learn that she will be receiving a number of monthly payments from various military departments for the rest of her life, as well as sizable life insurance payments from her husband's insurance company. Husbands of her friends begin to flirt with her, and she dyes her hair. In Pianosa, Doc Danica is ostracized by the men, who blame him for the increased number of missions they are required to fly. He is no longer allowed to practice medicine and realizes that, in one sense, he really is dead. He sends a passionate letter to his wife, begging her to alert the authorities that he is still alive. She considers the possibility, but after receiving a form letter from Colonel Cathcart expressing regret over her husband's death, she moves her children to Lansing, Michigan, and leaves no forwarding address. The cold weather comes, and Kid Sampson's legs remain on the beach, since no one will retrieve them. The first things Yossarian remembers when he wakes up each morning are Kid Sampson's legs in Snowdon. When or never returns, for new roommates, a group of shiny-faced 21-year-olds who have never seen combat join Yossarian. They clown around, calling him Yo-Yo, rousing in him a murderous hatred. Yossarian tries to persuade Chief White Halfoat to move in with them and scare the new officers away, but Halfoat has decided to move into the hospital to die of pneumonia. Yossarian begins to feel more protective toward the men, but they then burn Orr's birch logs and suddenly move Mudd's belongings out of the tent. The dead man who has lived there for so long is abruptly gone. Yossarian panics and flees to Rome with Hungry Joe the day before Nately's whore enjoys a good night's sleep and wakes the next morning to discover that she is in love. In Rome, Yossarian misses Nurse Duckett and goes searching in vain for Luciana. He accompanies Nately on a mission to rescue his whore from some army officers who will not let her leave their hotel room. After the rescue and a good night's sleep, Nately's whore falls deeply in love with Nately, and they languish in bed together until her little sister dives in with them. Nately begins to have wild fantasies of moving his whore and her sister back to America and bringing the sister up like his own child. But when his whore hears that he no longer wants her to go out hustling, she becomes furious and an argument ensues. The other men try to intervene, and Nately tries to convince them that they can all move to the same suburb and work for his father. He tries to forbid his whore from ever speaking again to the old man in the whore's hotel, and she becomes even angrier. But she still misses Nately when he leaves, and she is furious. With Yossarian when he punches Nately in the face and breaks his nose. Yossarian breaks Nately's nose on Thanksgiving after Milo gets all the men drunk on bottles of cheap whiskey. Yossarian goes to bed early but wakes up to the sound of machine gun fire. At first he is terrified, but he quickly realizes that a group of men are firing machine guns as a prank. Furious, he takes his gun to exact revenge. Nately tries to stop him, and Yossarian breaks his nose. Nately is in the hospital the next morning, and Yossarian feels terribly guilty for having broken his nose. They encounter the chaplain in the hospital. He has lied in order to be admitted, claiming to have a disease called Wisconsin shingles. He can now feel wonderful since he has learned how to rationalize vice into virtue. Suddenly, the soldier in white is wheeled into the room, and Dunbar panics. Dunbar begins screaming, and soon everyone in the ward begins screaming as well. Nurse Duckett warns Yossarian that she overheard some doctors talking about how they plan to disappear Dunbar. Yossarian goes to warn his friend but cannot find him. When Chief White Halfoat finally dies of pneumonia and Nately finishes his 70 missions, Yossarian begs Nately not to volunteer to fly more than 70 missions. But Nately does not want to be sent home until he can take his whore with him. Yossarian asks for help from Milo, who immediately goes to see Colonel Cathcart about having himself assigned to more combat missions. Milo has finally been exposed as the tyrannical fraud he is. He has no intention of giving anyone a real share of the syndicate, but his power and influence are at their peak and everyone admires him. He pretends to feel guilty for not doing his duty, flying missions, and connivingly asks the deferential Colonel Cathcart to assign him to more dangerous combat duties. Milo tells Colonel Cathcart that someone else will have to run the syndicate, and Colonel Cathcart volunteers himself and Colonel Korn. When Milo explains the complex operations of the business to Cathcart, the colonel, falling into Milo's logical traps, declares Milo the only man who could possibly run it and forbids Milo from flying another combat mission. He suggests that he might make the other men fly Milo's missions for him, and if one of those men wins a medal, Milo will get the medal. To make his plan possible, he says, he will ratchet the number of required missions up to 80. The next morning, the alarm sounds, and the men fly off on a mission that turns out to be particularly deadly. 12 men are killed, including Dobbs and Nately. The chaplain is devastated by Nately's death, which he learns about at the airfield where the men are returning from their mission. Suddenly, the chaplain is dragged away by a group of military police who accuse him of an unspecified crime. A colonel accuses the chaplain of forgery and interrogates him. His only evidence is a letter that Yossarian forged in the hospital and signed with the chaplain's name some time ago. He then accuses the chaplain of stealing the plum tomato from Colonel Cathcart and of being Washington Irving. The men in the room idiotically find him guilty of unspecified crimes they assume he has committed and then order him to go about his business while they think of a way to punish him. The chaplain leaves and furiously goes to confront Colonel Korn about the number of missions the men are required to fly. He tells Colonel Korn that he plans to bring the matter directly to General Dreedle's attention, but the colonel replies gleefully that General Peckham has replaced General Dreedle as wing commander. He then tells the chaplain that he and Colonel Cathcart can make the men fly as many missions as they want to make them fly. They have even transferred Dr. Stubbs, who had offered to ground any man with more than 70 missions, to the Pacific. General Peckham's victory sours quickly. On his first day in charge of General Dreedle's old operation, he learns that Skyskoff has been promoted to lieutenant general and is now the commanding officer for all combat operations. He is in charge of General Peckham and his entire group, and he intends to make every single man present march in parades. Yossarian marches around backwards so that no one can sneak up behind him, and he refuses to fly in any more combat missions. When informed of Yossarian's defiance, Colonel Cathcart and Colonel Korn decide to take pity on Yossarian for the death of his friend Nately, and send him to Rome to rest. In Rome, he breaks the news of Nately's death to Nately's whore, who tries to kill him with a potato peeler for bringing her the bad news. Her kid sister materializes and also tries to stab him. Covered with stab wounds, Yossarian goes to a Red Cross building to get cleaned up. When he emerges, Nately's whore is waiting in ambush and tries to stab him again. She follows him everywhere, even back to Pianosa, but he retaliates by flying her to a distant location and dropping her in a parachute from the plane. Yossarian still walks around backward, and, as word spreads that he has refused to fly more combat missions, men begin to approach him at night to ask him if it is true and to tell him that they hope he gets away with it. Worried, Yossarian's superior officers offer to assign him only non-dangerous missions if he agrees to fly. He refuses, because that would mean that other men would have to fly his share of dangerous missions. One day, Captain Black tells him that Nately's whore and her kid sister have been flushed out of their apartment by the military police and peace, and Yossarian is suddenly worried about them. Yossarian travels to Rome with Milo, who is disappointed in him for refusing to fly more combat missions. Rome has been bombed and lies in ruins, and the apartment complex where the whores lived is a deserted shambles. Yossarian finds the old woman who lived in the complex sobbing. She tells Yossarian that the only right the soldiers had to chase the girls away was the right of Catch-22, which says, "They have a right to do anything we can't stop them from doing." Yossarian asks if they had catch-22 written down, and if they showed it to her, and she says that catch-22 stipulates that they don't have to show her catch-22. Yossarian knows that catch-22 does not exist, but that its non-existence does not matter, because everyone believes that it exists. Milo agrees to help Yossarian track down the kid sister, but he becomes distracted when he learns about huge profits to be made in trafficking illegal tobacco. He slinks away, and Yossarian is left to wander the dark streets through a horrible night filled with grotesqueries and loathsome sights. Men beat dogs and children, a soldier convulses helplessly, a woman is raped, and the sidewalk is strewn with broken human teeth. He returns to his apartment late in the night to find that Arfi has raped and killed a maid. The MPs burst in. They apologize to Arfi for intruding and arrest Yossarian for being in Rome without a pass. Back at Pianosa, Colonel Cathcart and Colonel Korn want to send Yossarian home, but catch-22 prevents them. They offer Yossarian a deal. They will ground him and send him home if he will agree to like them. He will be promoted to major, and all he will have to do is support the two colonels. Yossarian realizes that the deal is a frankly atrocious betrayal of the men in his squadron, who will still have to fly the 80 missions, but he persuades himself to take the deal anyway. The prospect of going home fills him with joy. As Yossarian departs from Colonel Cathcart's office, Nately's Hoare appears, disguised as a private, and stabs him until he falls unconscious. In the hospital, a group of doctors argues over Yossarian while the fat, angry colonel who interrogated the chaplain interrogates him. Finally, the doctors knock him out and operate on him. When he wakes, he dimly perceives visits from Arfi and the chaplain. He tells the chaplain about his deal with Cathcart and Korn, and then assures him that he isn't going to do it. He vaguely remembers a malignant, almost supernatural man jeering at him. "We've got your pal," shortly after his operation. He then tells the chaplain that his pal must have been one of his friends who was killed in the war. He realizes that his only friend still living is Hungry Joe, but then the chaplain tells him that Hungry Joe has died, in his sleep, with Hupple's cat on his face. Later, Yossarian wakes up to find a mean-looking man in a hospital gown leering at him, saying, "We've got your pal." He asks who his pal is, and the man tells Yossarian he will find out. Yossarian lunges for him, but the man glides away and vanishes. Yossarian then has a flashback to Snowdon's death, which he relives in all its agony. Smiling at him wanly, Snowdon whimpers, "I'm cold." Yossarian reassures him and tries to mend the wound in Snowdon's leg, thinking that he will live. Finally, Yossarian opens up Snowdon's flak suit, and Snowdon's insides spill out all over him. Yossarian remembers the secret he read in those entrails. The spirit gone, man is garbage. He thinks to himself that man is matter and that, without the spirit, man will rot like garbage. In the hospital, Yossarian tries to explain to Major Danby why he can no longer go through with Cathcart and Korn's deal. He won't sell himself so short, and he won't betray the memory of his dead friends. Yossarian tells Danby that he plans to run away, but Danby tells him that there is no hope, and Yossarian agrees. Suddenly, the chaplain bursts in with the news that Orr has washed ashore in Sweden. Yossarian realizes that Orr must have planned his escape all along, and joyfully decides that there is hope after all. He has the chaplain retrieve his clothes and decides to desert the army and run to Sweden, where he can save himself from the madness of the war. As he steps outside, Nately's Hoare tries to stab him again, and he runs into the distance.